Hey guys, it's me, Istebrak. I want to thank you again for being my patrons for another month. I hope this video will be useful for your art journey. Today I'm going to be talking about something very important, which is working with references. This painting of mine that I did, I worked really, it was pretty quick because I worked really closely with my references and I learned a lot as I was doing it. And one of the biggest issues that I faced as I painted this, and one of the biggest weaknesses I noticed I had as an artist, is not trusting my reference enough. There's just this epidemic. I don't know why, but we kind of just take what we want from a reference and then move on. And for some reason, we always expect that to work. It doesn't work like that. A reference is a preservation of form signatures. What does that mean? It means we've captured form in that specific instance in time and preserved it in a photo. So that means that we can't just deviate and bring in our own lighting for the nose, because that's how we remember to draw noses. We can't just deviate and start using our own anatomy and start bringing in our own kind of light signatures that we've memorized over the face, or we're forgetting that the light's coming from two different angles, or forgetting that there are multiple light sources in the reference that we're using, and we forget to apply that. So shadows get diffused between multiple light sources. They don't always behave the same way. So when we work with a reference very closely, we make it's like an insurance policy that we have that makes sure that the anatomy is always intact and the form is always intact. If those two things are intact, you have a successful photograph. So that thing that you just saw right now, that flash, that was the reference that I used for the hand that I'm going to use in a bit. And I am morbidly afraid of painting hands. And it's because they always need referencing. And growing up, I never had access to references as much as I do today. The internet wasn't that big, or we didn't have access to the internet. So I learned to memorize as I went. But that isn't always going to help you. Sticking to your reference is really important. I use the reference for the breasts here for this pinup. Breasts are pretty much the hardest thing for me to draw because they have all this gradual gradient happening throughout the surface, and it's very delicate. And I literally painted with like a 5% brush, 5% opacity, because it's so difficult to capture the form signatures on breasts, especially difficult if you don't use a reference. So look at the way they look right now. This is before I finally gave in and brought in a reference. Look at how stupid they look. And the reason why they look so bad is because all that you see right now in the breast area, that's just my memory. So my memory can't be depended on so well. It can't be depended on for those specific form signatures found in breasts. So in a pinup drawing, you're always going to have to deal with cleavage, and that's why I say it's the hardest thing for me to draw, because there's just so much particular. There's so many. There's so much specificity in the shades that you choose, and you have to be really careful with the blending and which areas of the breast are experiencing secondary light source and which areas are in the primary, and where the core shadows are. So right now I just outlined pretty much what I'm going to do with the composition. You'll see the end result. I'm sure some of you have seen the finished piece already. But at this point I realize if I want this to be a successful painting, I'm going to have to get a hand in there. I can't hide away the hands like I usually do with my paintings. I have to get a hand in there doing some sort of beautiful gesture that'll complete this illustration, and I have to get in a reference for the breasts. Because other than that, it's really just showing off the only thing I'm really that strong in without a reference, and that's my faces, the faces that I paint. This one specifically, I used a reference for it, but not a photo reference. It was from Portrait Studio version 1, so it was before we got the final models, and I used the Portrait Studio model, and I chose the lighting I wanted. That's why it's so awesome, because you get to choose the lighting you want in your painting, so it's customization from start to finish. You don't have to settle for the references you find in Google. But for the breasts and the hand, I had to settle because we haven't applied full body and hand gestures to Portrait Studio, so I didn't have access to that. But just remember, when you work with references, it's not really a matter of cheating. A lot of people think that working with references is cheating because you are not using your memory. I don't know where that stigma started. I don't know who started it. May their ancestors be cursed. But it's the worst ever taboo stigma that I've ever seen in my entire life. When you have access to references, use them, because in the process of using them, you're teaching yourself form signatures that you're going to call on later. So you're improving your visual library, and that's the key term here. When we improve our visual library, whatever we paint after we've used that reference will be improved by that many points. So staying away from reference is staying away from a good visual library, which will always show in your paintings. I don't care if you end up, rendering a really good face. You're going to be stuck with that face for the rest of your career. You're going to paint that one face all the time. And that's the problem when not using references. You don't bring in external, organic signatures and features and different kind of less universal faces, more particular to a race or a gender or a type of bone structure. So when we don't use references, we end up getting stuck with the same old images we have in our visual library until they get dusty and worn out. And we will draw that same old picture, the same old face over and over and over and over again. All our females will look male or all our males will look female. It'll be a very, very sad thing to do to your to your reach, to your form vocabulary. So working with references increases your form vocabulary. Working with references makes sure that your form signatures are consistent to the reference that you chose. So you have to make sure you use the reference thoroughly. Don't just use some of it and then throw it away. The only reason why this painting of mine was successful, look at how much I'm messing around before I finally give in. I really couldn't get a grasp of it. I couldn't wrap my mind around the form. I couldn't understand how I was supposed to do it, so I just ended up erasing it, getting a reference, and finally settling and realizing I can't do this successfully until I have an instance where this really did happen in some light. I can't expect my mind to generate a 3D image for me on its own. It has to have an external object come in and then make that memory happen. So as soon as I did that, it started to read and I started to like my painting again. And that's the problem. We are in danger of not liking our painting halfway through and giving up on it. This painting I was so close to giving up on, along with many other paintings. I was really close to giving up on them. But referencing, it's like a defibrillator. It makes me love my painting again because the form reads. I worked so hard on that face and I really wanted to present this as a finished project. I don't really usually have time either, so I'm just swamped with work and I never get to paint personally, so I really wanted to finish this painting. And the biggest issue here is that I didn't settle for a reference soon enough, and it's my biggest problem. I'm really stubborn. So when I got the reference, the brush started to look really nice. It started to look realistic. I love that. I love that look, that complete finished look. And as you can see, I'm really careful with the darks because at this point I have a reference guiding me. Before I just threw them in there as if I knew what I was doing, and I was depending on my visual library to, I don't know what it would have done. It would really have just been a rendering, like a hover render. And if you watch my videos, that's like the worst thing to do is to hover render, especially if you don't know what you're drawing. If you use a reference, you don't hover render. So use a reference to get good form signatures and stay consistent. Using a reference makes you love your painting again. And using a reference makes you stop hover rendering. And using references actually makes you get a better visual library. It's just too many pros for us to be confused with the cons. Some of the cons that some people like to talk about are it makes you dependent. References are a crutch. That's not true. That's all lies. Because what happens is you will naturally deviate away from using references. You will naturally become so confident in your visual library, you will eventually stop using them. So it's not really a crutch. It's a crutch if you're using photo studies, like if you're doing an actual photo study like photorealism. So you're trying to paint a full photo realism kind of pixel by pixel, if you know what I mean, like a photo. Oh, is that a photo or is that a painting? That's when it becomes a crutch because you always need a reference. You can't really pull from your own visual library. But as artists, as creators, as people who create concepts, we actually have to build up our visual library in that way. We can't depend on a photo to render for us. So there's a lot of my painting that is creative. A lot of the stuff I didn't use a reference for. So the course that I didn't use a reference for, you can tell because it's very minimally rendered. The face I didn't use a full reference for. These are my own features that are in my visual library that I used. So you do eventually deviate away. The brain finds faster and easier ways to complete the same task. So you're not always going to have the same saturated dependency on a photo. You will eventually find some confidence in yourself and you realize, oh, I wanted to use a photo for this, but I happened to finish it before I got a chance to get in and find a reference. Well, it's just because you are in the state where you don't need that reference for that particular object anymore. Maybe for other objects, but for whatever it might be, you don't need that reference anymore because you have a good visual library that's been strengthened by months and months of hours and hours of practice with the use and support of a reference. We are creating objects that exist in a real world, that existed before our painting, before our canvas was made on Photoshop. So we have to realize there's a level of dedication we have to have in order to execute a realistic painting. The world came first and then our painting. So we have to bring in references. We can't be spooked by, it might be a crutch. It's cheating. It's not real art. That's bullshit. Excuse me, but that's not how it works. So there is a definite need in your career, if you don't use enough references, to start using them. And I encourage you to experiment with a combination of different references before you start painting. Don't wait, just like I did here, which is don't do what I did and wait till you're finished the face before you design the rest of the body. Decide what kind of gesture the hand is going to have. Decide what kind of design the body is going to have, which areas of the skin are going to be revealed that will need a reference for that. You can freestyle fabrics, you can freestyle clothing and all kinds of secondary objects, but for the skin and for the body, that's so much anatomy and so much science is involved. You really can't take any chances. So if you have a fully rendered face and you don't have the rest of the body design, you're going to have a bad time. You're going to have a slower rendering process, and that's not good. What we always want to do is fasten up or speed up our rendering process. So here I'm starting to do the hand, and I found a reference for it. It was like a sort of a come hither kind of reference, and that's just because I didn't really want to make her sort of a femme fatale. I wanted to make her sort of like like an evil witch, or like a temptress kind of witch. And that's kind of the theme behind the blue witches that I draw. I think this was the last of the blue witches that I'm going to be doing for a while. I don't know why I was inspired by it. I think it started in Halloween. But yeah, when I start right here, the biggest lesson is from today's video is stick to your reference, have faith in it. What I'm seeing here, what I saw here as I was painting, I was screaming inside because I'm like, oh my god, this looks like shit. Why am I even trying a hand? Like, I suck at hands. Why am I even trying? Even if there's a reference, I'm sucking at it. I have to depend on lasso so much. Why am I doing this? Why am I here? But I knew that I had to listen to what I preach and practice what I preach, and I had to just stick it out and wait through it. And that's what I did, and it ended up looking really good, and it was one of the most complimented parts of the painting. It's because I depended on my reference and I trusted my reference. So there's trusting your reference and finishing the form signatures as they happen. Don't freestyle. Finish your reference all the way. Your reference will give you love back for your painting, which it definitely did with this one. It works like a defibrillator. It gives you more motivation to work through your reference and work through your painting. And when it comes to actually using it and how we use our references, that's where it becomes iffy. So I'm sitting here and I'm campaigning for the use of references, but I will say, do not drag and drop your reference into your photograph, into your painting. And you can trace. So I've said many times tracing is acceptable because it's a way to experience the realism firsthand. So it's about tracing out the form, learning the pattern of the form as it happens in real life. So that's fine using your paint and a new layer, just painting over your photo. But it's not good to depend on it so much you have to drop tool it shade by shade. That's where it becomes a problem. You have to make sure that when you are using these references, you are trying to test your ability to eyeball. That's what I do. That's where I have that sort of that's how I balance it. I depend on my references, and a healthy dependence, but not so much that I'm grayscaling my reference and working in grayscale and drop tooling, or even not just in grayscale and color, using the dropper tool, the eyedropper tool, to get the values value by value. That's where it becomes a problem, because at that point you're no longer testing or training your eye and its ability to see values and the way the values climb, and its ability to see colors. So when we use references. It's a good thing to use it as a way to reinforce our knowledge of anatomy, but it's also a really good way to test our ability to see colors from a distance, to see whether or not am I really looking at a purpley red or a warm red? Am I looking at a pale orange or am I looking at a yellow? So when we depend too much on a reference like that, we teach our eye really not to see that stuff, or we don't even give it a chance to learn it. It becomes a crutch. That's the only time I will agree with the eye becoming a crutch. I mean, with the reference becoming a crutch for the eye. So at this point, the hand is starting to look a little better. It's starting to come together, and I'm okay with it, but still having some issues. But I'm way better than I would have been if I had tried to render the hand on my own with just my visual library. I know my visual library to be challenged specifically with hands, but I knew I had to keep pushing. So really trust your references, you guys. It will take you places. It will take your paintings places. It's not a cheat because not everyone knows how to use a reference. I mean, you have to have a certain skill level to paint the picture as it is in the photograph, to paint the object as it is in the photograph. So that isn't also, using references properly is also a display of your skill. So it's not some sort of weakling thing to do. It's not something that a weakling does. You guys definitely have there's definite merit to be found in your use of a reference, successful use of a reference. I've seen a lot of students who don't have don't have form vocabulary, so they don't know about depth, they don't know about when to blend, when not to blend. That try to paint from references, and it really looks nothing like the reference. It looks very flawed. It shows where all the weaknesses are in the student, all the studies the student has been avoiding or hasn't yet executed. So using references isn't always a display of dependency or lack of skill. In fact, it is a display of skill. It is a way to show off how well you can see form. And that leads me to my final point. A reference that is used successfully is a successful memorization of that reference. So because you sit there staring at it for hours, you're for sure going to remember the way that you painted it. You don't sit there 3 hours rendering something and forget about it that easily. You will remember it for a long time. Imagine doing that study over and over again every single day. So using references every single time, saturating your art career with reference use, will always keep you in that hyperdrive of improvement. And there's really nothing matched to match it. The only thing I would say that's better than or as equal to your improvement as using references is form studies. Form studies are just like the next best thing, which is reading form. Form is a really tricky thing to see as it happens because it's a combination of what's blended, what's not blended, the way light acts on edges, cast shadows, blended cast shadows, sharp cast shadows, gradients, highlights, which areas are highlighted, texture. All of that stuff is a lot of vocabulary to remember. So when we use this, when we use references, form signatures become easier to see as we go on. So you will draw better with references as you use references. So the first time you use a reference isn't necessarily going to be the best use of a reference in your life. It's going to be pretty weak. But the more you use it, the more you realize, oh, I know this kind of area of the flesh, I can use a soft brush for it because that's how the texture behaves. So you read the form as it happens on the object. And that's really what it's all about. Increasing your form vocabulary, improving your ability to see form as it happens, and memorizing form as it happens in your mind, in your visual library, so you can call upon it later. You don't necessarily memorize the photograph, but you memorize the way the form happened in that photograph. And you memorize the way that you painted it. And next time you paint a hand or an arm or a knuckle or a nose, you'll be like, I know the pattern that my brush had, I know the kind of brush I used, I know how I blended color or brought in the reds in this area, because all of those are reinforced by a real photograph of a real instance of realism, of a real instance of light on form that happened in the real world. What is better to use as a reference, a painting of a reference or an actual photograph of something that really happened? Of course it's the photograph. And you will depend less and less on photographs as you go, less and less on anything really. So the proof of that is the belly button. I actually didn't use a reference for that because I just had a visual library for it. My form studies taught me to make the shadow on one side and the light on the other because the light was coming from the top right corner of the canvas. So that's proof to me that my use of references in the past has benefited me in the future. I didn't catch a reference. I used a reference for the hand and the breasts and for the shadows on the face. But for the face itself and the belly button, for some reason belly buttons just came fast to me, I didn't use a reference for them. So that is a full proof to me, sort of, because I'm stubborn sometimes, and I also I'm really stubborn, and I delay my use of a reference, which is why I'm lecturing about it today. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you have to use it, and it's like you've wasted 3 hours, and you have to erase the breasts and erase the hands, so that you finally give in for a proper use of a reference. I didn't end up using the shoulder pads actually, so just ignore those. But really, really, the use of a reference is the best thing you can do for yourself. Don't delay it. Don't say until I learn some form or I learn how to draw a face, then I'll start using references so I can, bring in a different kind of face. Start now. Start as soon as possible. Your faces only get better. Your noses only get better. The hair you draw only gets better. The objects you draw only get better. Your landscapes get better. So it's not just for portraiture or pinup art. It's for everything. So thank you for watching. I hope these videos help you. If you want to catch some more of what I do, I have a lot available on my website. And if you want to see the final version of this painting, it's available on my DeviantArt and ZoomUp and on my website. So thank you again for your patronage. You guys are amazing. I will talk to you next month. Bye-bye.